After listening to Lecture 2, I took some time to think about how I was going to plan out my mind map. Um, since we are learning about kind of the history of reading, I made a three-tiered bookshelf, and on the bookshelf, the years are labeled, so I split it up into three different sections. So there's the 1900s to the 1950s, and then the 1960s to the 1980s, and then from the 1990s to present day, as well as at the bottom, when I researched, the topic that I researched, which was the International Reading Association, I put that on the bottom, and I'll explain why later. So the reason that I made a bookshelf was because I feel like this PowerPoint was super informative. However, it kind of just brushed the surface of what the history of reading is all about and what kind of happened. So I made a book title for each topic that I thought was important, and I will go over those. And I left some blank spaces for books, because as this course goes on, I want to fill out my whole mind map, so it will help me to continue to become a better reader and a better reading teacher. So in the 1900s, the first two books that I put down were the New England Primer and the McGuffey Reader, just because they were like the first two readers in reading history. So I put those down, and then the next title I put was English Instruction is Everything, because that happened between the 1900s and 1919. Then I labeled one of the books Groundbreaking, when we learned about how between 1914 and 1919, it was a period of significant reading research, and they talked a lot about oral and silent reading and the differences between them, which I thought was pretty interesting to learn about how you can comprehend things differently when you read them out loud opposed to when you're reading silently. So some of the books, that's why I named it Groundbreaking. Then I named another book title on here, Spelling Rules, to remind myself about Ernest Horn. Then the next book is What is a Reading Teacher? Because during that time period between 1914 and 1919, people were emerging understandings of the reading teacher and their role. So that was the next book title. Then I named the next one All the Elements, and this is based off the person Edward Thorndike, how he had this elaborate procedure, that reading was an elaborate procedure with many elements. That's why I named it that. The next book title I named was Boring Basils, and the reason I named it that was because it was a book that kind of told you how to teach and told you what to do, and just from what I took from it, there wasn't too much creativity as there is now. So I named it Boring Basils, and how they were in the classrooms, and then they were little booklets that kind of guided you how to teach. The next book title that I did was Read This Book and You Can Teach, which kind of went off the Basil readers because it gave you that, step-by-step instruction on how to approach the topic. Then the next book title that I named on here to remind me of what I learned after listening to the presentation was Turn Off the Radio and Read, how they were worried that radio influences may affect reading. That's what I took from it. The next book title I put was Early Reader Response Theory. That kind of came around from Louise Rosenblatt, so I wanted to write a title about her so that I could remember that on my mind map. The next thing was I labeled one of the books Dick and Jane, just because they were such an important part of reading history. I even remember my grandmother had a bunch of them, and we would read them when I was little, and I loved to listen to them. However, people don't use them anymore to teach reading. So I did put that just to remind myself of the history of reading and how far we've come. And then the next thing that The next book title that what I named it was Turn the Page, and that was to identify with the 1950s and how it was a turning point, and there was a major change in reading teaching, and there was a lot of questions going around about how reading should be taught. So that was the last book title on the first bookshelf for the 1900s to the 1950s category, and again I left some blanks because hopefully as this master's program goes on, I will be, putting little titles in just to remind myself of things that I've learned. So for the second shelf, for the information that we learned from the 1960s to the 1980s, I named the first one SQ3R question mark, basically indicating it was something new that people had to learn. So it was survey, question, read, recite, and review. That was one of the book titles that I chose. The next one was instructional strategies for reading. Around this time, there was a lot of different strategies that were taught. So I just kind of wanted to write it there to remind myself that there are so many strategies out there and that it's a good thing to keep researching into new strategies to use on our students. The next book title I name is Comprehension is Important. This is kind of a discussion about with the different strategies, comprehension, word ID, skills, specific reading skills, sets a purpose for reading, and encourages students to monitor their comprehension while reading. So that was important. The next book I named was Word ID Skills. Then the next one was What's the Point of Reading? Then I wrote a title all about Kenneth Goodman when we were learning about his miscue system and his cueing systems. I want to learn a little bit more about that, so I wanted to remind myself. Then I labeled the next book Chaw's One and Only Reading Principles, which was in the 1960s, and it was the best approach to reading, and it was the best approach to put the reading debate to rest. Then I named the next title Goodbye Dick, to signify that they were not using Dick and Jane in the 1970s to teach reading. I think that's a really important piece of the reading history, so I wanted to also remind myself that that happened. The next one was Goodbye Jane. That's the title that I chose. Then the next book title was Children Should Be the Center of Learning. I think that's a huge turning point when that happened, because that's kind of how we are today, that we are teaching these, small lessons, and we're guiding the students and we're being their model, and then we let them go off and, teach some things for themselves, which is super interesting. So I put that there to remind myself of when that turning point kind of started to happen. Then the next one was Be Active and Social in the Classroom, again, kind of going on with the children-centered learning. The next thing that I put was for the next book title was Are We at Risk? To remind myself that what I learned about the 1980s. In 1983, there was a nation at risk. The nation was at risk. And then in the next book title, I said is called We Are Readers, to remind myself that in 1984, it was becoming a nation of readers. Then the next book title I have is Phonics or Whole Language, kind of that debate of is phonics better or is whole language better? And what we found was that it should be a balanced approach of phonics and whole language. And then I, again, left some blanks because as the course continues, I want to hold this mind map with me so that anything that I learn about the history of reading that I can add into these years, I will. Then my next shelf is 1990s to the present, and the first book title was called The War is Over, to signify that the debate of phonics and whole language, they shouldn't be taught as separate. They're both important, and they should coincide with each other. Then the next book title is Phonics is Great, just to remind myself how important phonics is. The next book title I wrote is Whole Language is Great, and then the next book title was They Are Better Together, to kind of show that stage that they're both really good, but they're even better together. The next book title that I chose is Read by Third Grade. In 1999, there was legislation, and they had some goals, which was to teach every child to read by the end of third grade, more high-quality family history programs, and to provide early intervention. So the next book titles after the one that I named Read by Third Grade, I named one of the book titles Family is Important, another one called Early Intervention in Reading. I'm a special education teacher, so when I think of early intervention, it's something quite different. However, for myself, I think it's important to think also in the terms of reading. So I put that there to remind myself. Then the next book title I named the National Reading Panel, which I learned it assesses the effectiveness of reading programs. It also, tells us that phonics is important and that it is especially important for students in kindergarten through sixth grade and for lower readers. So I would like to learn a little bit more about the National Reading Panel, so I put it there to remind myself. The next book title I put on my shelf is Phonics Are Still Important. They're still important in this time period. And then after that, the next book title I put is Reading Fluency. And then the next book title is Oral Reading versus Silent Reading, which is something that I learned. Oral reading, you get more feedback from your instructor, which is completely true. And then silent reading, you get a little bit less feedback. And that's where we teach the kids to, teach them different skills on how to comprehend things. Then the next book title is What is No Child Left Behind? I'd like to dive into that a little bit more too, which was created in 2002. And then the Common Core, which is something that I am familiar with. And the next book title is Evidence-Based Instruction. I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into that as well. And the one topic that I chose, which was the last slide, the organization that I chose was the International Reading Association, which was created in 1956, and it enhances literacy instruction. It has published over 900 books on issues in literary education, which is really, really interesting. So I was glad that I chose this organization because I would like to look more into those book titles so that I can become more aware of what they've researched, as well as they've developed and managed many global literacy projects, which I think is super important. So again, what I did for my mind map is I made a 3-tiered bookshelf, and I labeled it from 1900s to 1950s on the first shelf, 1960s to 1980s on the next shelf, and then the 1990s to present on this shelf. And the reason I took off the international reading is because I wanted to show myself that I did a little bit of research on my own and what my plan is over the course of me being a graduate student. I want to take time to take a look at all these topics on their own so that I have a better understanding of the history of reading. So thanks for listening, and I hope everyone has a great night.